The strange world of Mr. Davis.
The part of my childhood I remember the most is going to summer camp. Being able to learn about nature and hang out with a bunch of kids that shared the same interest I did, it was amazing. Now, while my mind is basically ramped with memories of all the good times I have, there was always one event that stuck with me. It hit me on a level much deeper than the silly memories. It was the one time in my young life that I can remember being completely frightened. It was the cabin incident. It was the last week of camp. Normally, we would be sleeping outside in the tents during the summer. The cabins weren't very well ventilated and they could get pretty muggy. It was always better to sleep outside when there was at least a little bit of wind that could blow through the mesh windows of the tent. During the last week, however, there was a pretty sizable rainstorm predicted to hit the camp head on. With that rainstorm, they were calling for some serious winds that could take our tents with it, whether we were in them or not. The counselors told us that we'd have to tough it out and sleep in the cabins. They had just put screens on the windows last year, so we could open them up for air, so maybe it wouldn't be too bad. We were gravely mistaken. It was an all-boys camp, and even at that age we all acted pretty macho, but the first night we were all down to our whitey-tighties trying to stay cool. The rain did come, and it came hard. One kid took his blanket and pillow and headed over to the window and just laid on the floor. He claimed it really helped, but we all couldn't fit down there at once. We devised a plan to take turns. There were 6 of us left who hadn't done it, and there were 6 days left of camp. It worked out perfectly. Days passed, and finally on the 4th day, it was my turn. Throughout the day, the kid who went before me, I believe his name was Andy, told me not to go through with it. I thought maybe he was trying to get my spot so he could go again. "You're not taking my spot, Andy. It's my turn. That's just fair." His voice was weak and trembling. I don't want to do it again. There was something outside all night. I'm afraid it's going to get you. It almost got me." I didn't want to believe him, but when you're 8 years old, you believe just about anything. "What are you talking about? There's nothing out here." "I saw it," he persisted, almost in tears. "It was tall and black. It had red dots for eyes." He stopped mid-sentence. I could tell he was definitely spooked about something. "There's nothing out here. Don't worry." I wasn't going to let someone take my spot under the window. It was way too muggy, and I was looking forward to that one night of relief. The day went as expected. Nearly every activity we did was indoors. We learned some new knots, learned how to track animals, all kinds of awesome stuff. When lunch came around, Andy spoke to me again. His voice was still shaky. "I've been seeing it at the windows, Jake. You really shouldn't sleep under the window." Part of me believed him, and another part of me told me that if I slept in my bed, he'd taken my spot. "I'm not worried about it, Andy. You didn't see anything out there." He blew me off and went to go sit with some other kids. I ate by myself that day. The following night around 8 p.m., we all went to our cabins to head to bed. As soon as the counselors were gone, I dragged my pillow and blanket over to the window. Andy tried to call out to me one more time, persisting that it was a bad idea, but I could feel the instant relief wash over me. Even the slightest of winds helped cool me off. Being able to hear the sounds of nature was also a big plus. Before I knew it, I was asleep. I woke up sometime later to the sound of crunching leaves outside. The rain had given up a bit and the sounds from outside were much more prominent. I thought nothing of it. Plenty of deer had walked onto our campsites before. Why wouldn't they do the same with the cabins? I let my eyes glance up at the window. I saw the huge trees swaying back and forth in the wind, the stars in the sky, but that was soon blocked out by something. A large, dark mass stepped into view. It had a vaguely human shape, but it wasn't the right proportions. I could only see it from the shoulders up, but I knew this had to have been what Andy was talking about. Sure enough, I heard someone crying on the other side of the room. It was no doubt Andy. Him and I were the only two, as far as I knew, who had heard about this thing. My eyes tried to make out any recognizable shape, like a hat or ears, but nothing would come of it. All I could see was this inky figure looming over me. That was until it opened its eyes. I can still see them this day. They were just as Andy had described them, even worse. They were bright red, almost like they gave off their own light, and beady like a rodent's. Once they opened, they didn't close. I was paralyzed. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but the only thing my body could do was open the floodgates. And once they were empty, I gained the ability to scream my head off. I woke everyone in the cabin up, and the counselors who were sleeping nearby came rushing in soon after. They got everyone situated and then pulled me to the side to talk to them. I tried explaining what happened, but they wouldn't believe me. I can't blame them, really. I was just some 8-year-old who just pissed his pants. The following nights were pretty hard to get through. The other kids slept under the window without an issue, though. I'm not sure why me and Andy seemed to be targeted by this thing, whatever it was. I'm just glad I haven't seen it again. I did go back to camp the following 2 years before my parents decided I was too old. I never saw it again. Andy, on the other hand, never came back. From what I heard from the other kids, one who lived in the same neighborhood, he threw a fit when they tried to get him to go. I can't blame the kid, honestly. He seemed pretty messed up. I've always wondered what it was that we saw. Was it an alien or something? Maybe an undiscovered forest creature? I don't know. What do you all think? My wife and I were taking a break from the city life for a while when this happened. We'd heard about this amazing lakeside resort that rented out cabins, and we knew we just had to go. We both come from very busy cities, so it would be a nice change of pace. At least that's what we thought. Now, the time we spent there was pretty awesome, don't get me wrong. It's what happened in the final night there that makes us wary about going back. It was a fairly long day full of barbecuing, swimming, and jet skiing. It was a great end to an even better week. We were lying in our bed that night, looking up through the skylight, talking about how we could just spend the rest of our lives here. We contemplated buying out one of these cabins when we became a bit more financially stable, not just for a vacation home, but maybe our full-time living space. It was close to town, and everyone we met was very kind. Our heartfelt talk was interrupted by something slamming against the skylight. My wife and I both jumped at the sound. It sounded like something had been thrown against it. "What the hell was that?" my wife said. I'm not sure. You didn't see anything?" "No, I was nearly asleep." And then we heard something else, something a bit more concerning. The roof of our cabin began creaking like something was walking across it. It was so loud we could track the noise with our eyes. We followed it all the way to the skylight. As we stared up at it, we saw something lunge over it. It was so quick that we could have missed it if we blinked. I thought at first it was some kind of mountain lion, as we were fairly close to a mountain range, but there was a big problem with this theory. There wasn't any hair. Now, I know animals don't often have hair on their stomachs, but this was different. There was no hair anywhere. My wife tightened her grip around me. "What the fuck was that?" she whispered. I wanted to respond, but I just couldn't find the words to do so. The creaking began again. I reached over to the nightstand for my cell while simultaneously trying to follow the creaks. As soon as I turned on the display for my phone, the creaking stopped right beside the skylight. I was able to call the guy who owned the property and tell him what was going on. What he said sent chills all over my body. "Listen to me. Turn your phone off and go to sleep. This thing is nocturnal. It's completely blind, but it can hear you through the windows. The best thing you can do is try and ignore it. The longer we're on the phone, the better chance of it hearing you." He then hung up. I was freaking the hell out. My wife, who'd overheard the conversation, snatched the phone from me and turned off the display. I pulled her close and we held each other all through the night. The creaking only subsided when the sun came out. We wasted no time in packing and heading home. I stopped at the owner's place to drop off the key to the cabin. I knew he could tell I wanted to say something about what we'd seen, but I kept my mouth shut. I was exhausted after staying up with my wife all night. My body was drained. I just didn't feel like trying to extract an explanation. It's been a few years since this happened, and while we have looked into some lakeside properties, we've decided on staying far from that one. From all the research I did, I can't find any record of a hairless, nocturnal creature that can climb onto a roof, let alone one that's totally blind. I think I'd rather not know. I'm a big fan of the outdoors. I often drive to places I'm not super familiar with just to go walking through the nearby woods. I already know what you're thinking, so I'll go ahead and say it. Yes, I've gotten lost. Multiple times, but I've always been able to find my way back. One incident, however, has always stuck with me. It's always the story I tell when people ask, "What's the scariest thing you've seen doing this?" My response is always two words: the cabin. It was in the woods of California that I saw it. Now, there isn't anything inherently scary about an abandoned cabin in the woods, but what happened inside is the real story. I'd stumbled across it after walking for around an hour. It was a godsend at first. I was beat. Something about these woods were really kicking my ass. I knocked on the door first. It looked abandoned, sure, but you never know. The outside was pretty weathered and covered in vines. Some of the windows were even knocked out. It was pretty beat. I'd seen worse with people living in it, so I approached with caution. The last thing I wanted was to be chased out by a meth head. Again. I walked in calling out, "Hello? Anyone here?" No one responded. I took a seat at a table in what I assumed was the dining room. It was a fully furnished cabin, albeit in terrible shape. The floor sunk in places and the walls were covered in some really disgusting looking substance. I'm not 100% sure what it was, possibly black mold. I rested for a bit, pulling my shirt over my mouth to keep anything that might be floating around in the air out of my lungs. I browsed through Twitter before deciding it was probably best to leave. I was in there no more than 20 minutes. It couldn't have been any longer. When I walked out of the cabin, though, it was nearly pitch black outside. Checking my phone, I saw that it was 8 p.m. I walked into that cabin no later than noon. I wasn't under the influence of anything, and I never fell and hit my head or anything like that. After all these years, I've never been able to come up with an explanation for what happened. I'd love to hear any theories. I've read up on a few stories like mine, but no one can really seem to come up with a concise answer. I highly doubt I was visited by aliens or anything like that, as some have suggested with cases like these. Let me also go on record and say that I've never been able to find that cabin out there again. I know it's kind of a wild goose chase, but this happened years ago. You'd figured I'd run across it again sometime. I even went as far as asking people in town if they knew anything about a cabin in the woods. No one was familiar with one. And the story just kept getting weirder, so I finally decided on just forgetting about it and chalking it up to a weird occurrence. I was out camping a year or so ago when I came across something really freaky. Where I was camping wasn't public property. It was privately owned, however, I knew the guy who owned it. We'd been friends since middle school, and so he gave me free roam as long as I cleaned up after myself. Of course I did. This was my third or fourth time camping out here, and I hadn't had any issues so far. Whether with animals or people, it's always been a pretty mellow experience. The experience I'm going to tell you about was the only strange or scary thing that ever happened. I had went to my regular spot, one I'd cleared out myself and found to be the best spot. There were enough trees around for shade, but you could also see the stars really well at night. This night in particular, I was doing just that. Laying on a sleeping bag, just staring up at the stars, with the bitter fall air biting at me. For complete transparency, I was a little high. Nothing serious, mind you, just a little weed. I just want to make sure I give you guys all the details. I was almost asleep when I heard something off in the woods. I couldn't pinpoint it at first. It seemed like it was coming from everywhere. I focused in on the noise and soon it smoothed it out into something recognizable. Chanting. Yeah, it was definitely chanting. I grabbed a flashlight and started walking through the woods trying to pinpoint it. And soon I did. If I had to guess, I would say that I was about half a mile out at this point. The chanting was growing louder, and with a little more searching, I found the source. I kept low, not knowing what I was dealing with. Looking through the tree line, I saw another clearing, like the one I had made, only much, much bigger. There were about 15 people all around a fire joining hands and chanting something. I couldn't really make it out. They were yelling it so loudly it all kind of mixed together into nonsense. They were all dressed in very long robes as well. Now I was starting to get a better idea of what I was dealing with. Then it got a little too real. A few minutes passed and one of them broke off from the group and walked into the woods, returning soon after with a cat carrier. He opened it up and pulled out a small cat, holding it by the nape of its neck. I wanted to look away, really, but part of me didn't believe he would do it. It was like a car crash. You know it's a terrible thing, but at the same time, you can't look away. He pulled a knife from the inside of his robe, and that's when I turned and started running back to the campsite. The chanting seemed to grow louder, and I could imagine why. Then I heard the most horrific sound an animal can muster. I knew what happened. I vomited on the way back to my site. I took refuge in my tent and tried to get some sleep so I could leave early that morning. Sleep did come, but after a long fight. That morning, once I was back home, I called my friend who owned the land and told him what I had seen. At first he didn't believe me, but I insisted, and when I started talking about what happened to the cat, he stopped me. "Alright," he said, "please, don't go on. Do you think you could show me where it happened?" "Yeah, it shouldn't be too hard." "Awesome. We'll go out there today and set up some game cameras. Hopefully we can find out who these guys are." We headed out a little after lunchtime and were soon at the site where it all went down. The plot for the campfire was still there, surrounded by rocks. There were a handful of trees with pentagrams carved into them, and sadly, we also found the cat. We buried that and gave it a makeshift headstone. My friend had 5 game cameras. We set up 3 about waist level behind the few branches. They'd catch a decent picture, but were impossible to see through the branches. The others were set up a little higher to get a better perspective of the whole ordeal. We let the game cameras run for a few days before we went back and recovered them. When we did go back, we were really worried because 2 of them had been smashed. Apparently, they weren't as inconspicuous as we once thought. The people who done it were fairly smart as well. The memory cards had also been smashed. The few cameras that were left, however, gave us what we needed. Back at my house, we put the SD card in my laptop and started scrubbing through the footage. It got to be around midnight of the first night when they showed up. Soon the fire was blazing and they were joined in hands once again. It wasn't until one of them broke off from the group, assuming to do what they did the other night, that the first camera was found. The footage from a different camera showed him taking it from the tree and showing it to everyone. He then seemed to order everyone to find more and do the same as he was. The camera we were watching was almost found, however, somehow the guy didn't see it despite looking almost directly at it. This was perfect for us, however, because it gave us something to show the police, and that's exactly what we did. I'll save you some listening time and tell you that the police were just as disgusted as we were. Luckily, they took it very seriously and were a huge help in finding out who was trespassing on my friend's property and, more importantly, doing this to the animals. There was a formal investigation, and last I heard, they were able to identify 3 people from the group. They refused to give up any names, however. The police told us about the guys they'd caught, saying they were some real characters, Charles Manson type folks. Those who were caught were charged with multiple counts of trespassing and animal cruelty. Sadly, that's all they could be held on. I'm sure they were released just after a few months, sadly, but I'm hoping that we were able to disband whatever it was they were doing. As far as my friend goes, he set up more game cameras and checks them regularly. So far, in all the time since this happened, he hasn't caught anything. He's even started renting out some of the campsites during the summer. And before you ask, yes, he discloses that he has game cameras out there. Looking back on it, I can't help but think about how differently it could have played out. What if they heard me when I was watching them? There were 15 of them and just one of me. Would they have attacked me? Jeez, it's scary to think about. I'm pretty lucky, I guess. Story 2. You're perfect. I cannot believe I'm about to tell this story. I've held off on doing so for a while for reasons that will become clear as you listen. It starts back in college. I was in freshman year and was having some trouble making friends. I was never the most popular guy and wasn't exactly a stud. More like a stick, actually. I'm tall, scrawny, and weigh 120 soaking wet. That's why when Rachel, the most attractive girl in my first class, started talking to me, I was very surprised. Even more surprising was the way she spoke to me. It was never a friendly conversation, it was always about me. She also spoke in an overly sexual tone. Meet me at the fountain this afternoon. I've got something to ask you. I nodded nervously and said, yeah, okay. She laughed and walked back over to her seat. That afternoon, I sat on one of the benches near the fountain and waited for her. I thought for a while that I'd been stood up, however, she did eventually show. I didn't mean to keep you waiting, she said. Someone as perfect as you should never be kept waiting. I thought what she said was weird, yeah, but I was thinking with the head between my legs and not the one on my shoulders. We talked for a while, her continuing to use that sultry voice. I noticed that she'd pulled herself closer to me and leaned towards me. She whispered, "I've got something to show you." My heart was racing. She put a hand on my thigh and said, "But we have to wait till the night. Meet me here again tonight at midnight. Understand?" Like I said, I was thinking with the wrong head. Obviously this was sketchy as hell, but I went through with it. I showed up to the fountain a little after midnight and was met with a small group of people. I'd say about 6. Rachel was standing in front of them. They were all people I'd recognized either from seeing them in class or just in passing. Her arms were crossed over her chest and she said, "I told you he was perfect." They all nodded in unison. I knew at this point something was up. "So, Rachel, what's going on?" She laughed a little and walked over to me. "We're going to tell you something that you can't share with anyone, okay?" She took my hand and we started walking over to the group. They all crowded around us, looking at me like I was a prized piece of meat. Don't panic. The group lunged forward and grabbed my arms and legs. I was scooped off the ground and couldn't move. I tried to scream, but something was shoved into my mouth. "We're going to take you somewhere, and you can't ruin this for us." She pulled out a switchblade. "Understand?" I nodded nervously, and they carried me over to the parking lot where I was put into the back of an SUV. They all piled in and pulled out. The drive seemed much longer than it actually was, I'm sure. When the car stopped though, I thought about trying to run, but they had a car. I had my sheer leg power. Given what they'd done so far, I was sure they weren't above running me over. I was pulled from the back and escorted into the middle of the woods. I had no idea what was happening or where I was. They pushed me into the middle of a clearing and formed a large circle around me. Rachel started, I guess the best way to describe it would be preach to everyone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today because we have found the perfect one. He's intelligent, fit, and pure. I'm not really sure how she knew I was a virgin, but that was the least of my worries. We're here tonight to give him off to the higher power, to grant us with all that we desire. I started to get an idea of what was going on. Firstly, this entire group was totally bananas. Secondly, I started to devise a game plan. I eyeballed everyone around me and picked out who would be the easiest to get by. It was without a doubt the girl to my right. She was short and about the size of a stick. I watched Rachel preach as she circled around me and waited until she was to the right of me. As soon as she was, I bolted over to her, pushing her to the ground. Everyone was so caught off guard they didn't move. Rather, they looked down at her in disbelief. I took my chance and busted through the circle, pushing more people to the ground. I didn't know where I was going, but I just booked it. I could hear everyone running and screaming. I knew that they would find me if I wasn't fast enough. The adrenaline pumped through my appendages as I pushed by fallen trees, branches, and stumps until I was able to find the edge of the forest. Once I was out, I spotted the SUV and immediately jumped in. By sheer luck, the keys were in the visor. I cranked it up and spewed dirt from the tires while pulling out. I drove one direction until I came across a 24-hour gas station. I used their phone to call the police. A few squad cars showed up there and I explained everything that had happened. I was happy to see how seriously they took it and called in a few more officers to conduct a search of the woods. Meanwhile, I was taken back to campus with another officer. I made it back safe and was up all night hoping to hear some kind of update. That came early the next morning. A news story broke about 8 a.m. telling everyone who watched what happened. Everyone in the group had been found and were to be taken to trial. They were facing abduction charges and false imprisonment charges. Everyone on campus soon knew what happened, and because of this, and because I was shaken to all hell, I took the rest of my semester off. I went to my parents' house to stay over the summer, and they also heard about what happened and were more than happy to take me back in. Looking back on all this, I can't help but believe Rachel and all of her friends had to be part of something sinister. I don't know what kind of higher power she was referring to, and I don't plan to find out. Nowadays, about 8 years later, I still think about it at times. I've moved out of state since, and I've also cut ties with most of the people I was actually friends with back then. I don't want any connections to that town or college. It just feels too risky. I know it's probably not a big deal, but I just can't think of opening communication with that part of my life again. Story 3. Made it out. This is a story I'd never thought I'd get out. I thought for sure it would always stay in between me and my closest friends. However, for some reason I just feel like I need to share it. Maybe I can help someone. This story takes place when I was in a very dark place. I was addicted to heroin and totally homeless, hopping from shelter to shelter. Occasionally, I would walk the streets of town late at night, partly because I was looking for a fix, and also because I thought maybe I'd come across someone who would help me. One night I did. At least I thought they wanted to help me. It was an older man who approached me. I was digging through an ashtray looking for a short when he came up to me, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You need help, son." He was a very well-off individual. He wore leather gloves, a long, fancy overcoat, and smelled like cologne. I would guess something like Chanel Men's. Usually I would take offense to what he said, but there was something about him. I didn't feel like he was judging me. I felt like he knew what I was going through. "Come on, walk with me." He motioned with his hand and I followed. We started making our way down the block, and he began telling me all about a place that he ran that could help me. "It's a place for people of all walks of life," he said. "A place for acceptance." I remember how convincing it was. I really believed that whatever this place was, it could actually help me. While I would never admit it at the time, I needed and wanted help. So I asked him, "Where is it?" He reached in his coat pocket and gave me a card. It was professional as hell. I can still feel the weight of the cardstock as I held it. As I was staring at it, he began to walk off. I tried to get his attention, but he was turning the corner by the time I'd noticed he was walking off. I put the card in my pocket and went back to the shelter. The card had an address on it, as I'm sure you've been able to figure out at this point. I was fairly familiar with the street it was on, so I decided on setting out that morning, as it was going to be a hell of a walk. That morning after eating, I set out. An hour or so of walking, and I was standing in front of the building of this guy's congregation, for lack of a better word. I won't be sharing the name of this place. It doesn't need the notoriety. As a matter of fact, all the names and places have been changed for privacy's sake. I walked in and was greeted with a church-like setting. There were pews on each side, a stage at the front with a podium, and a large emblem I'd never seen before on the far wall. The pews were filled with those in attendance, and the man I'd met before was standing behind the podium giving a sermon. He noticed me and just nodded, but continued on. I thought he was going to talk to me afterward, but to my surprise, he changed the subject of the sermon and called me up on the stage. I want to change it up a little bit today, ladies and gentlemen. He motioned for me to come up. Once I was up there with him, he put his arm around me and continued on about how sometimes life deals us with a bad hand, how I was dealt the hand of addiction and needed a new dealer to help me out. What he said to me in this moment blew my mind. "Do you believe in God, son?" I nodded. The whole crowd gave disapproving grunts and howls. He held up his hand to silence them. He then looked back at me and said, "You don't need him. He put you in this situation. What you need is the Good family." That brought an eruption of applause from those watching. Once it died down, he explained what it was, what they believed, and how they worshipped. It was intoxicating. I believe the reason I fell for it so quickly was because I was in need of something, anything to get me out of the situation. I was at rock bottom, and I thought this was my ladder to get out. The man and his wife took me in and gave me somewhere to sleep and food to eat. They even employed me in their building so I could generate some income. A few months had passed when he came to me one morning and said, "Today, you begin a new life. I only do a sermon like this every few months. You and a handful of others are going to learn how to fight off the dark you have inside you." For the record, I'd been clean for around a month. He'd found heroin on me once or twice, but he was able to get me off of it. Convinced me I didn't need it. "I know you're sober," he explained, "but there is still a craving there. Am I right?" He was. "Today's sermon will help with that." He smiled, and I smiled back. Later that day, the usuals, I call them, filled the pews. Near the front is where I was seated, and when he walked out to begin, a group of about 4 people lined up on the right side of the stage. I assumed it was part of the sermon. "Today, ladies and gentlemen of the Good family, we're releasing evil. These great family members have had amazing progress since they've joined us, but there is still some darkness in there." He motioned for me to step up. I followed order. This was going to be the moment I was going to be saved. I had put all my faith into this. I stood beside him at the podium, and he turned to me. I could feel the anticipation. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the leather gloves, putting them on. Pulling them tight, he said to me, "Are you ready?" I nodded, ready to be saved. He lifted his hands above his head and started reciting something just loud enough for me to hear. His hands came down slowly and finally rested on my neck. Before I knew it, I couldn't breathe. He was nearly crushing my windpipe. I swatted at him, kicked, clawed, and tried to scream, but nothing would come out. He was now screaming the prayer, and everyone in the pews followed suit. It wasn't until I was about to black out that I was able to kick him where the sun doesn't shine that he let me go. I fell to the ground to catch my breath. My throat burned and my eyes were watering. He called out through the pain, "There's still dark in you. We need to get it out." I wasn't going to let him do this again. I booked it out of the building and ran to the nearest shelter. I just slept and didn't bother telling anyone about what happened. The following morning, I used the money I had saved up to take a trip down to the town my parents lived in. I met up with them at their house and told them everything. We spoke about pressing charges for a while, but I ultimately decided against it. I didn't want any reason to put that insane man and his following in my life again. I stayed with my parents for a while. I ended up finding a job at Walmart and was able to start making enough money to afford my own place. I'm still clean to this day, nearly 5 years later. Be wary of those who wish to help. You never know their true intentions. I'm still not sure what his were, but I knew for a fact that they were no church. He preyed on the weak so he could feed his bloated ego and gain notoriety for actually not doing anything helpful. As a matter of fact, he was basically committing assault. Looking back on it, I should have reported him. However, I was worried about him or those who followed him coming to find me. I just hope some of those people see what he's doing is wrong and get out of there before it's too late. I've been a forest ranger for going on 5 years now. I don't feel it's necessary to disclose my location, so please don't ask where these take place. With that out of the way, I also want to say that I'm not a professional when it comes to the paranormal creatures. I don't have an explanation for most things I went through and experienced. Maybe you all can help me with that. With that said, I'll start with the first encounter I had while patrolling the forest where I work. We got a call about a possible wanderer. A wanderer is someone who walks off the path and is either lost or up to no good. I can't tell you how many teens thinks it's cool to smoke weed in the woods out here. Anyway, I took the call and started driving down the ranger trail so I could find whoever it was. The description they'd given me was tall and slender. Not much to go off of, but I figured it was better than nothing. I was nearing the end of a specific trail when I heard something off to the east of me. I looked over in that direction and saw a quick flash of color ducked behind a tree. I called out, "Hey! You can't be out here. It's for personnel only." They didn't respond and didn't come out, so I started walking over. I was left speechless when I came up beside the tree I'd seen this figure go behind, and there was nothing there. When you're in the woods, it's not really easy to make it out without being heard. I looked all around, but there wasn't a sign of anyone. I walkied my superior and let him know. He said to do one more run of the area and if I didn't find anything to report back to him. After my second patrol, I still found nothing, so I did what he asked and reported to him afterwards. He asked what color I saw ducked behind the tree, and I explained that it looked like someone with a red flannel shirt and blue jeans. He just laughed and said, "That was probably Sebastian." I was lost. What do you mean? Is he just void of punishment or something? It's kinda hard to punish a ghost. I shot him a skeptical look. Sebastian was a young kid who was attacked by a bear out here about 15 years ago when I first started. He's never really left. From that day forward, I saw Sebastian a handful of times. I've also seen apparitions here and there. The most notable apparition was when I was giving a tour of the campgrounds that we have out here. There was a small group of people with me when a woman raised her hand and asked, "Are we allowed by the river?" She then pointed over to the bank where I saw a woman in a white nightgown. Yes. However, we require that everyone who can't swim or is not a legal adult wear a life jacket. You can't swim in it either, as the current is very strong. However, the life jackets are just a safety precaution. I called out to the woman near the bank. "Ma'am, do you mind joining my group up here? You really shouldn't be down there." Her head turned to face me slowly, and when it did, I felt all the color drain from my face. She didn't have any eyes. They were just black pits. A few of the people in the crowd gasped, and a few kids hugged their parents in fear. I looked back at the group and they looked at me for an answer, but I didn't have one. When I looked back, the woman was gone. We just continued on with our tour after that, with a palpable awkwardness and uneasiness. When people find out I work where I do, I'm often asked if I believe in Bigfoot. The short answer is no, I don't. My longer answer would be that there are much more things out there, things that are scarier than a Bigfoot. Here's my story of one of them. This will also be my last story, as it may give an idea of the location of my workplace, and I don't want people visiting just because of these stories. That's not a good reason to come out here. The real reason would be to enjoy nature and all it has to offer. With that said, I'll stop beating around the bush, no pun intended. I was doing another patrol when something ran out in front of the patrol vehicle. It's really a golf cart with our logo painted on it. Thinking I'd hit a fawn or something similar, I hopped out, radioing the lead ranger. When he asked for a description, I didn't really know what to say. This thing was about the size of a full-size German Shepherd, but was all black and had a shiny coat. The body type was also similar, but there were no ears and no sign of there ever being any. There also wasn't a snout. I don't mean that it was squashed in like an English bulldog, there just wasn't one. The face was flat and pointed with two small slits at the front. The lead ranger showed up, and soon after we spoke over the walkies. He was just confused as I was. While they were transporting it, however, some campers got a few pictures of it. These were turned into the local news station and they ran a piece on it in the newspaper. It never made it to television, thankfully. The last I heard, there have been no new updates about what it could be. I hope you all get a little bit of enjoyment out of these stories, maybe even feel like you can share some of your own. Depending on the response to this, I may share a few more, but as of now, I think I'll keep it under wraps. Story 2. Boy Scouts. When I was 8, my parents put me in the Boy Scouts. Now, despite what you're about to listen to, I still believe it was one of the greatest things I ever did. I loved hanging out in the woods, learning about survival, and all that good stuff. Being that a large part of the courses we took were in the woods and dealt with wildlife, you'd expect me to have at least one spooky story. Well, I can assure you that any Boy Scout has at least one. This is mine. I'd been in the Boy Scouts for about a year at this point. We were covering something to do with leaves in the woods. I'm not sure what it was. That's beside the point, though. Once the lesson was over, we were paired up and told to go out and find the biggest leaf that we could. It sounds silly, but it was a ton of fun. We were instructed not to go out of eyesight of the scout leader, but the kid I was with didn't listen. He kept looking back at the scout leader to see if they were looking our way, and as soon as they looked away, he booked into the forest. Now, we were taught that if you were ever separated from your partner, then to blow the whistle they'd given us. That wasn't really going through my head, though. I stupidly gave chase, calling out, "We're not allowed to go out there!" He just kept running. Eventually, he stopped and turned to look at me. He'd been a few years older than me, maybe 10, so when I saw that he had a cigarette in his mouth, I wasn't too surprised. My parents did it all the time too, so I figured it was just something that adults and older kids did. "We need to go back," I said. "I can't see the scout leader." He just laughed and took a drag from his cigarette. "Fine," I said. "I'll just get their attention." I reached for my whistle, but when I pulled it out, he knocked it out of my hand. "You better not get me in trouble. I'll beat you up." I took this seriously. I wasn't the biggest kid, but he was older than me, and I assumed he was stronger. He was laughing for a little bit before he looked behind me, and that's when his face went white. I figured the scout leader had found us, but it was much, much worse. He dropped the cigarette butt and booked it back towards the scout leaders. I ran over and stomped it out like a responsible little Boy Scout. When I turned around to leave, though, I saw what it was that scared him so bad. For lack of a better word, it was Bigfoot. It was tall, hairy, and smelled like absolute death. The hair on its face and hands was matted with what I assumed was animal blood. I pissed myself then and there. It wasn't moving, so I tried to fight all my logical thinking and ran over to my whistle that was on the ground. I made it to it and blew it as hard as I could. I'm lucky this thing was slow because it could have taken my head off. The whistle sounded and the creature cried out before running off into the woods. Soon after, I was scooped up by a scout leader and we were soon all back at the Boy Scout camp. The leaders gave us a long and stern talking to about forest safety. One thing I remember vividly is when he said, "There are some things out there that will hurt you." It seemed like such a terrible thing to say to children, but I knew he was right. We still went out to those woods after that, but never saw anything like it again. Story 3. Aokigahara. I had been staying in Japan for about 10 years when this took place. My reason for staying there in the first place was studying abroad. Once my studies were over, however, I ended up going back. I love the culture and just enjoyed being there. I've met someone now and we're getting married in the fall. Life had seemed pretty figured out. Just the last week though, something happened that caused a lot of turmoil and strain on my relationship. It started when a buddy of mine hit me up on Skype. He, like me, was American but came to build a new life in Japan. Being 5 years older than I was and spending more time in Japan, he had been to just about every notable site here and had 2 kids. We were shooting the shit for a while when, kind of out of nowhere, he brought up Aokigahara. Now I'm fairly certain that almost everyone knows what that is. If you don't, then look it up real quick because I'm not going to explain. Basically, he told me that he would pay me $500 if I could camp out there alone for 2 nights. My wife, who is native to Japan, could not protest enough. She told me all these horror stories of people going in and never coming out, people being followed home by spirits, all kinds of stuff. I told her I wasn't afraid of some silly forest, and I agreed to the bet. The day I left, she begged me not to go, but I did. I wanted to prove to her that there was really nothing to worry about. Well, that, and I really wanted that $500. I kissed her goodbye and headed out. Walking up to the forest is something sinister, man. While it is beautiful, it's also extremely foreboding. The density of these trees is beyond reason. I'd never seen anything like it. As soon as I stepped in, I was taken aback by it all. It was like another planet. I heard all the wildlife, whether it be bugs or animals. I heard a handful of other people walking around as well. The temperature had dropped significantly. I wouldn't admit to anyone who asked, but I was scared. I told myself it was nothing more than a forest and continued on. My trek through the various trails did eventually lead me to a spot flat enough and secluded enough to camp. It was around 7 p.m. at that point. Night 1 was a go. Sleep came, but after a long fight. Everything I heard around me made me jump. I didn't know what kind of animals lived out here, and also given the reputation the forest had, I was beginning to get a little worried about those who were in here with me. I woke up on that morning feeling groggy. I didn't want to leave my tent, honestly. I wanted to leave the forest. I decided that I would hike down to the base of Mount Fuji and give that a look. All through the forest I was taking photos. I needed something to prove to my friend I'd actually done it. I got some great photos of wildlife, some trees, all that good stuff. Halfway through my hike, however, I decided on putting my camera away for the rest of the trip. I heard a woman weeping off to the east of me. I decided to walk over and see if I could help her at all. When she was finally in sight, I saw that she was a young woman, maybe in her 20s. And there was another woman, much older, possibly her mother, who was holding her to her chest. They were both kneeled on the ground in front of a body. It was absolutely heartbreaking to see. The older woman made eye contact with me and we shared a small moment. I could tell that she was holding back tears. I nodded to her as a way to say, "I understand. It'll be okay." And I went about my way. I'm assuming the body they were kneeling in front of was a relative, possibly a brother, maybe a father. I didn't get a good look, and I had no plan to. I continued walking, trying to get that out of my head. It was so hard to shake that image, though. I took a rest at the base of a tree and just thought about everything. Myself, my fiance, my friend, and mostly this stupid challenge. I left the forest and went home after 20 minutes of deliberation. Let me explain my decision. When I went there, I knew what I was doing. I was going to visit a place people regard as spooky or scary. And while it is both of those things, I feel like I lost light of what else it was. It's a place where those who have lost all hope, a will to move forward, go to end the most precious gift given to us: life. I wasn't looking at it through the eyes of someone like the woman who'd found someone they loved here. I was looking at it as some sort of attraction you'd visit for Halloween. It was disrespectful, I felt. Over the course of the next few months, I fell into some pretty serious depression. Seeing how quickly life can be taken away from you, voluntarily or not, is a sobering thing. It put me in a state of mind where I believed nothing really mattered. No matter what we do in this life, have kids, get married, whatever, it didn't matter because we all lose it all in the end. This is where the strain of my relationship came from. I wasn't as lovey-dovey as I'd once been. My fiance and I were fighting all the time, we weren't making love. We even got into a small physical altercation at one point, causing me to storm out of the house. And guess where I went? That forest. I went all the way there and just stared into it, thinking about all I'd seen and all that had been going on. I contemplated on going inside, but I knew if I did, I wouldn't come out. The thoughts I was having weren't good ones. They came and went in waves as I was standing there. But then one specific thought entered my mind. The thought of that woman I'd made eye contact with. I remembered that while she struggled to do so, she wasn't crying. She held it in. She was strong. That's what I needed to be. I made it back home to my fiance and broke down, telling her everything. I was eventually put on antidepressants, and lucky for me, they've worked wonders. It's been nearly a year on them, and I'm thinking of trying to lower the dosage. I've not had an episode of depression in quite a while, so I think it'll be alright. So yes, I went back, but before you bother asking, no, I didn't see any ghosts or hear any phantom voices. Maybe it's because I wasn't looking for them. Maybe it's because they weren't there. I don't really know or care. The point I want to get across here is that if you're going to visit this forest, please know the real reason you're doing it. If you want to get a cheap thrill, it's better to just stay home. Calling it one of the scariest places to visit is like advertising a graveyard as a ride at a state fair. I apologize if this story doesn't fit the horror shtick that is usually on here, but I really just wanted to share this. What I did see in there was something much scarier than ghosts or spirits. It was morality. I saw what people have to deal with when a loved one dies, something I haven't had to deal with much in life. Feel free to grill me in the comments for not posting something scary, but I just really had to get this out. Be aware and honest with your reasons for visiting Aokigahara, and then reevaluate your decision.